Hey everybody. This is a section from Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord. The section is located in part 2 of the book, which is titled The Practice of Theory. I'm reading just each of these sections as they're in video because the parts that they're located in, which kind of are structured like chapters, are very long. So this one is called the Debord Myth. The last one that was read was titled May 1968 and After. I think you can get something out of reading any one of these pieces, even if you don't read the whole piece. The events of May 1968 bestowed a measure of unanticipated notoriety on Guy Debord, never having been fond of the limelight, least of all that of a society they despised, and being of a naturally discreet disposition. Debord proceeded in the aftermath of May 1968 to make himself more inaccessible than ever. Debord would have nothing to do with the many groupuscules in several countries, all of whom claimed the mantle of the situationists and spent most of their time in crude vendettas passed off as revolutionary activity, nor did he heed the attempts to co-opt the luminaries of 1968 and turn them into literary editors, academics, politicians, or at the very least willing talk show guests. His position was unwavering. Quote, I would find it just as vulgar to be an authority in the resistance to society as to be an authority within society itself, end quote. Debord. The very act of withdrawing, however, led to Debord's being described as, quote, the most elusive of men with one of the most significant trajectories of the last 25 years, end quote. And he was accused of by some of disappearing precisely as a way of burnishing the myth that surrounded him. I'm going to say this from mine. I don't know if you ever read Guy Debord's. I haven't read it in a long time, so this is just talking about like in the most vaguest of memories. But I remember reading it maybe like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that. And it just being so full of just like mythologizing. Just like kind of like not like talking about like a biography. Or like a biography of like that's just kind of like doesn't really tell you anything about their life. It's just like lived in this kind of place and this kind of place, and I just loved Arthur Craven because he just was so anti bourgeois society in his practical everyday life, and this like doesn't say anything about himself. It's just kind of just like imprecision and like trying to generate intrigue is the vibe that you get from it. But that was just my take of it. I don't know. I haven't read it in a long time, so maybe I wouldn't think that now. Maybe I'd see more value in that kind of style and see something in it as opposed to like mystificatory like romanticism. But you kind of see this in everything that kind of like takes from the Debord style. I feel the same way, especially about like groups like fucking like Tikkun or like the Invisible Committee, who kind of like if like they kind of like what's it, coquette, is that the word? When Marx says he coquettes with Hegel's with Hegelian language or something like that. Like they kind of have that situationist tone, and it feels very like abstract, like imprecise, relying a lot on like rhetorical tricks and like sentiment and beauty, which is an attractive thing, and I accept it as part of the thing I accept it, but at the same time I'm kind of like, man, like what did I get any out of this except like vibes? I don't know. There's just a certain like French, like, I don't know, artsy, like pretentious kind of like style that just like kind of leaves me feeling cold at the end of it. While at the same time I find the language extremely like invigorating on the other hand. Like I find for some reason I find it attractive, but I feel like cheated at the same time. I feel cheated by the attraction, you know. Like I feel like the excitement of the abstraction is not filled in with like a richness of content, or at least like a content that's made explicit. You know what I mean? Like I'm getting way more from reading Anselm Jappe's work about Guy Debord than probably reading lots of Guy Debord himself, because it's written in a more Jappe probably wouldn't like this, but a more like academic style. Anyway, where the hell am I? This alleged disappearance of Debord was in actuality quite relative. During this time, Debord formed a friendship with Gerard Lebovici, a brilliant and unconventional cinema impresario who in 1970 had founded and financed the small publishing house Champ Libre. In 1971, Debord entrusted Lebovici with a new edition of the Society of the Spectacle, and from 1974 on, though in no official capacity, he began to play a decisive role in running Lebovici's unique company. Unique because, ignoring considerations of profit entirely, Champ Libre published text on the theory and practice of revolution ranged from Hegel to Bakunin. From Saint-Just to the Spanish anarchists. The critique of Maoism, Stalinism rubbed shoulders with Champ Libre's list, which, with such classics as Omar Khayyam and Baltasar Gracian, George Orwell and Karl Kraus, while forgotten writings of Clausewitz or the German Dadists, or Georg Grodeck or Malevich, were given a new lease on life. Simon Leys' Les Habitudes Neufs de President Mao published in 1971, was a genuine bombshell, for it was the first enunciation of the Maletry, end quote, that prevailed among French intellectuals. English translation by Carol Appleyard and Patrick Goad, The Chairman's New Clothes, Mao and the Cultural Revolution. That's actually super exciting to read that, because this book that's being referenced here, I think, was pretty important for Lauren Goldner, and I think it's kind of was one of the first things to put forward the idea of like there's this idea that that is prominent among the Western left, and especially among people who tried to interpret Maoism in kind of like a libertarian or anarchist way, because it's so full of like passion and voluntarism and like populism and shit like that, to try to make the Cultural Revolution appear as though it were like some organic spontaneous rupture in like the core of Chinese society against the bureaucratization of socialism, comparable perhaps to something like, Hungary 1956, or like Poland, or like East Germany 1953, or any of these kind of like major revolts or whatever. And obviously there was moments within the Cultural Revolution that kind of stepped beyond what was actually prescribed. But the fact of the matter is that the Cultural Revolution was a power struggle at the top ranks of the Communist Party of China, and Mao used his appeal by directly summoning the people to act in an insurrectionary way against the government to sort of clean the swamp. I think that kind of analysis of the Cultural Revolution is extremely important and should be returned to. And I think that it should be very much, when people talk about the similarities between Maoism and anarchism, they should really rethink that. But then again, it's a difficult question of saying, like, what is anarchism? And like, is anarchism just like this kind of like fiery-eyed romantic anti-capitalism, or is it something that's a little more scientific and rigorous and less ultra-voluntarist, right? I think that's the thing that people they see the comparison between Maoism and anarchism as being like this kind of like ultra-voluntarist, like, I don't know, just like destructive view of destruction as inherently creative or something like that, which is like not something in my mind that is really shared by anarchists in general. There might be similarities between just like, I don't know, people who just like anarchists who like dumb anarchists who don't read, who are just kind of like interested in like punk politics and like vengeance and like breaking windows and shit like that without any actually clear conception of what a substantial alternative to capitalist civilization is. There might be some like overlap in like just like the total like destructive nature of like their politics, which don't have any like I don't know, creative substitute or any like clear conception of what the society they're fighting is, or what the society they're trying to achieve is. There might be an overlap between like that particular type of anarchist and like, I don't know, just like Maoist, like insurrectionary thuggery. But I would say that the comparisons are very slim. Sorry, I'm just rambling on, but it's good to see that Simon Leys, because I didn't know that it was with like, he published a thing with a radical press. I think I'm going to read that book next. That's very fucking interesting. Anyway, shook up the French left's naive conception of the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, back to the text. Where the fuck am I? I'm sorry for rambling like that. I just drank a whole cup of coffee, like chugged it down, and now I've got my yackers on. Where the fuck am I? And it's sick that they publish fucking Orwell too, because I think Orwell is someone that needs to be, who's as a figure needs always to be emphasized. Naturally, Debord's own works and those of other situationists also appeared under the Champ Libre imprint. Lebovici's most provocative act as a publisher, however, occurred in 1984 when he issued L'Instinct des Morts, The Death Instinct, the memoirs of Jacques Mesrine, France's most infamous criminal and, quote, master escape artist, end quote, considered public enemy number one until his barbaric elimination by the French police. Lebovici, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I don't know how to pronounce Italian words. Like, I don't know if a singular standalone C is a K or a chi, but ch sound, but it's Lebovici. Lebovici. Lebovici and Debord deliberately maintained execrable relations with the press and the so-called intellectual world. Champ Libre, which is spelled like Champ Libre, but I think it's probably Champ Libre. I don't know. Acquired a terrible reputation in the eyes of many people, and to quote Debord himself, quote, the publishing house was shrouded in a sinister atmosphere of continual conspiracy against the whole world, end quote. Ample confirmation of this is supplied by the 2 volumes of its own correspondence that Champ Libre published in 1978 and 1981, for the letters reproduced are full of exchanges of insults, sometimes occasioned by the most trivial of considerations. Lebovici made many enemies, made for the first part, no doubt during his meteoric career in the film industry. In 1984, Lebovici was found shot dead in a parking garage. The crime has never been solved, but the French press was long fascinated with the fate of this out-of-the-ordinary figure, with his double profile as rich entrepreneur and patron of the ultra-left. All the newspapers around Debord's influence on Lebovici inexplicable. Many spoke darkly of, quote, manipulation, unquote, accused Debord of leading Lebovici, quote, astray, end quote, or intimated that he somehow shared more responsibility for the death. Some publications went much further, however, charging that Debord was associated with terrorist groups and that he had ordered the killing of his friend in accordance with the following, quote, logic, end quote. Quote, Lebovici was killed, ... for having refused on one occasion to do something that he had been expected to agree to do, end quote. Confronted by these extraordinary insinuations, Debord took the uncharacteristic step of bringing suit. The courts found in his favor. The following year, Debord published Considerations sur l'assassinat de Gérard Lebovici, a work in which Debord wrote above all of himself, enumerating the press's frequently bizarre claims about him, indeed deriving a certain satisfaction from the Mephistophelian role Debord was often assigned in deploying his well-known polemical talents. Accompanied by Alice Becker-Ho, whom he married in the early 70s, Debord moved around a good deal, mainly between Paris, Auvergne, Arles, Italy, and Spain. In 1988, Debord returned, quote, Alice Becker-Ho is the author of Les Princes de Jargon, I think that's probably Princes of Jargon, reprinted by Gallimard Press, Gallimard Press in Paris, 1993. It was originally published in 1990, and of L'essence du jargon. L'essence du jargon, which I guess is the essence of jargon. I'm not sure. In 1988, anyway, end footnote. In 1988, Debord returned to social criticism with his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, a book that aroused a good deal of interest, and not only in France. The following year, the first volume of an autobiography appeared, significantly entitled Panegyric. In 1991, Debord parted company with Edition Gérard Lebovici, later renamed Edition Yves Ray. Beginning the next year, 6 of his books are republished in Gallimard, France's best-known publisher. Footnote. For Debord's account of his, quote, contested divorce, end quote, from Edition Gérard Lebovici, see, quote, Quête mauvaise réputation, ... end quote, see, cette mauvaise réputation. As for the Gallimard arrangement, it was eventually broken off in 1997 after Gallimard had published a book slandering Debord, and further publication was entrusted to the publishers Arthème Fayard. I apologize for the crummy pronunciation, but it's the best I can do. Where am I? Come on. The French press was by this time mentioning Debord more than ever, and in Cette mauvaise réputation, published in late 1993, the only new text produced in the last 5 years of his life, he commented sarcastically on a large number of articles referring to him. Those who had been shocked by Debord's willingness to sign a contract with Gallimard were in for another surprise when a film made in collaboration with Brigitte Cornon for Canal Plus Television was aired on the 9th of January 1995, along with 2 earlier films of Debord's. This was Guy Debord, Son art et son thème, in which Debord illustrates, quote, his art, end quote, by means of a shorter version of the black silent screen of his first film and his, end quote, his time, end quote, by means of a selection of some of the most ominous television images of recent years, accompanied by occasional titles offering such comments as the following, quote, these, the most modern events in historical reality, have just perfectly demonstrated what Thomas Hobbes thought the life of man must have been like before the advent of civilization and of the state, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote, Debord. Well, that's a comment from the Debord's film, so it's not like Debord speaking directly, I guess. Only hypocrites would pretend surprise at the bleakness of this picture of the state of the world, but of course there is no shortage of hypocrites. On the 30th of November 1994, Debord took his own life in the home at Champeau, Haute-Loire, by shooting himself in the heart. He set forth the reasons for this act in a title that appeared at the end of the television broadcast, quote, illness called alcoholic polynortis. First signs appeared in autumn 1990. At first almost imperceptible but progressive, became truly distressing only late in November 1994. As with all incurable diseases, there is much to be gained by neither seeking nor accepting medical care. This is the opposite of an illness that you contract through an unfortunate lack of prudence. On the contrary, contracting it requires dogged determination over a whole lifetime. End quote. That's fucking hilarious. Funny guy. As noted earlier, Debord allowed himself to be called a theoretician. He always described himself, however, as a filmmaker and presented this as his only real métier. True to the idea that the work of destruction of the old values could not continue indefinitely, and that it was needful to proceed to a new and positive use of elements already existing in the world, Debord followed his first film, which was devoid of images, with others that contained them. It was very rare for Debord to do any shooting himself, and practically all the images Debord used were détournements from various fiction films, historical documentaries, newsreels of political events, or advertisements. Footnote. Even the few frames that he did shoot, however, were sufficient to place Debord among the all-time great cinéastes, or at least that was the view expressed in La Quinzaine littéraire for the 1st of July 1981, as quoted in Ordures et Décombres des ballets à la sortie du film in Guillaume Imas Nacht et Consumimur Igni. Rubbish and refuge unpacked in response to the film in Guillaume Imas Nacht et Consumimur Igni. That's fucking funny. All right. These accompany a voiceover text, though as a rule without illustrating it directly, in the two short subjects on the passage of a few persons through a rather brief period of time of 1959 and Critique of Separation 1961. This text includes sometimes melancholy thoughts on the life of the situationists and their historical role. Debord nevertheless once told the other situationist that he had never made a situationist film, and indeed the Situationist International made it clear from the beginning that none of its interventions should be viewed as anything more than prefigurements of future situationist actions. Other film projects of Debord's dating from this period were never realized, but later Debord's friendship with Lebovici gave him an opportunity to return to his first love, the cinema. In 1973, Debord, quote, brought the Society of the Spectacle to the screen, end quote, as a film in which the reading of passages from the book was accompanied by a collage of images. Unlike Debord's earlier films, the Society of the Spectacle was shown in movie theaters, albeit on a very modest scale. To the press's reaction, which varied widely, Debord Riposte was another medium-length film, refutation of all the judgments, laudatory as well as hostile, passed up to now on the film, quote, the Society of the Spectacle, end quote. An epigraph to this film, Debord quoted Chateaubriand, quote, there are times when contempt should be dispensed only in the most economical manner, by reason of the great number of persons in need thereof, end quote. Of those who had passed laudatory judgments, he observed that they had, quote, loved too many other things to be able to love film. Quote, they have, quote, loved too many things to be able to, quote, love, quote, his film. Of those who had passed laudatory judgments, Debord observed that they had, quote, loved too many things to be able to love, end quote, his film. Sorry, there's some italics in here that I wanted to reread. That's a very interesting thing. I actually really like that a lot, and let me tell you why. To interrupt the reading. The reason that I like that so much is because Debord, I think, among other things, and this is not just true of like, well, there's obviously like the fact that he's like the critique of the Society of the Spectacle has kind of been like subsumed by like critical media studies and things like that, and like kind of like the academic world, and like, you know, like of course people are going to use it that way, and it's like fine if they do, but like as long as they like you know, at least are honest, like or like try not to defang Debord. But there's also the other thing of like people like citing Debord as just like another like radical left figure who didn't have critiques of the left, right? Like that's a very important thing about that I think is really important. People say they love Society of the Spectacle and like say they love like Mao's Little Red Book in the same breath, or like talk about Debord and then talk about like, I don't know, just some tanky bullshit, as if like completely stripping Debord of any critique of other segments of the left, and especially the bureaucratic Stalinist form of the left, as well as like the you know, especially that form of the left, and his councilism, like that. There's this idea. I think this is a problem just in like philosophy and like philosophy and theory and just like the humanities in general, where it's kind of viewed where there's just too many thumbs up being given, right? Everything gets a thumbs up there and nothing gets a thumbs down. So like people will like, you know, view every philosopher as interesting as if they're all kind of saying the same thing and everything's like compatible with each other, right? So like what I was saying about like people liking Debord and then all these other people that like Debord would have that Debord did in fact have nothing but contempt for, and like kind of just like acting like the left, the history of like critique that can broadly be categorized in the left is one big happy family, or at least like a critical you know, diverse family, as if there was not like absolute hostility. Or should be absolute hostility between certain groups of the left. And you kind of see that with like, you know, especially with like publishers who like kind of like publish like all leftist thought in general. They're just like a general left-wing press. people can get the idea that all the things that that press puts out is like just like, you know, catalog. People kind of view like philosophy and theory and like politics as like the way you might view like bands. Like I like bands and musicians and musical artists of all different stripes and varieties, because I'm not forced by logical coherence, by the needs of like logic or reason, to say one type of music's wrong and this other type of music is correct in some kind of definitive way. I can like the Bee Gees and I can like fucking, I don't know, some fucking gnarly fucking black metal, and I can like all kinds of other things and not feel really too much of like a contradiction in my spirit. But if you're like saying that like, oh yeah, you really like Mao Zedong and you really like Guy Debord and you really like Slavoj Žižek and you really like I don't know, Alain Badu, but you also like you know, fucking somebody else, you know, that, or like I'm really into like there's like, you can't just be like, I give everybody a thumbs up. You have opponents, and if you give everyone a thumbs up in if you give a thumbs up to like everything, you don't actually give your thumbs up to anything. You don't actually you have to take a side at one point. Whereas like art, you don't really, or at least generally speaking, art and music, you don't have to take up like a side or something like that. But in politics and critical thought, you have to. And some people are just like, oh, I like everything. And yeah. There's a point where like it's like if you turn up all you know, if you turn everything to 10, there's nothing distinct coming out of. There's nothing distinct about like what's coming out of the amplifier, I guess, is the idea. Like maybe a metaphor, right? You have to turn some things down in order to you have to put some things down to elevate other things. And if you like just Guy Debord's film, I guess what he's saying here, in my interpretation, I don't know who gives a shit about my interpretation. It's like, if you like everything, you like nothing. If you think everything is cool, you think nothing is cool. If you love everybody, you love no one. So, I don't know. Sorry, that was it. I'm fucking this recording up with all my yik yak. Debord's masterpiece in the cinema, announced as his last film, was In Giram Immus Not et Consumiram Igni, which was made in 1978 and released in 1981. The title is a palindrome meaning. Quote, we go round and round in the night and are consumed by fire, end quote. In Giram, the title is a palindrome meaning, quote, we go round and round in the night and are consumed by fire, end quote. To ensure its exhibition, along with that of all of Debord's films, Lebovici bought a small Latin Quarter cinema, the Studio Cujar, and dedicated it exclusively to this purpose. In 1984, however, in protest against the press campaign that followed Lebovici's murder, Debord withdrew all his films from circulation, with the result that no one was able to see any of them until, in 1995, the Society of Spectacle and Refutations were shown on television along with Guy Debord, Son Art et Son Thème. Critical opinion on Debord's films is sharply divided. The myth surrounding their director, coupled with the impossibility of seeing them for over a decade, caused these films to become the object of considerable fascination in certain quarters. Some critics describe them as utterly original, evoking the debt owed Debord by other, quote, avant-garde directors such as Jean-Luc Godard. Footnote. At the time of this writing, the only really serious discussion of Debord's cinema is Thomas E. Levin's long and well-disposed article, Dismantling the Spectacle, the Cinema of Guy Debord. Three articles devoted to Debord appear in Cahiers du Cinéma. A telling instance of the, quote, precursor of the video neo-avant-garde, end quote, approach to neutralizing Debord is the would-be retrospective devoted to him by the, quote, Rasegna Video d'Auteur of Taormina Art Festival in 1991. See the catalog accompanying this event. Dissensi tra film, video, television, and the connected. And in this connection, Debord himself cited an article in the periodical Traffic in the winter of 1991 in which Serge Dany poked fun at the public debate on his films at Taormina and pointed out that hardly any of the participants had ever seen them, end quote. In footnote. Most observers, however, even once they could no longer ignore Debord's other activities, have persistently failed to evince much interest in his cinema. Debord himself attributed this lack of interest to a conspiracy of silence provoked by the fact that his cinema was even more transgressive than his theoretical works and constituted an intolerable, quote, excess, end quote, in the eyes of the spectacle's minions. Quote, so great was their distaste that they stole far less often than from me here than, quote, so great was their distaste that they stole far less often from me here than elsewhere, end quote. Debord's personality emerges particularly clearly from his films, especially in Guillaume. Although that personality can hardly be detached from any of the public actions of someone who, as he himself put it, never did anything except follow his own tastes and, quote, seek to experience in the course of my life a good number of poetic situations, end quote. Someone well acquainted with Debord has described Debord as, quote, the freest man I've ever met, end quote. Debord certainly interested his contemporaries not only by virtue of his theoretical and practical contributions, but also by reason of his persona and by reason of the living example he set. Debord's glory is that he never sought to make a career for himself or to make money despite the many offers Debord must have had in this regard, that Debord never played any part in public affairs, nor received any diploma from the state except for his baccalaureate. Baccalaureate. I don't know how to say that. Baccalaureate. I don't know. That he never mixed with the celebrities nor made use of the channels of the Society of the Spectacle, and that he nonetheless contrived to play an important part in the history of his time. Debord exemplifies a quest for personal consistency, a consistency that did not arise as in others from an ascetic ideal, but rather from a genuine disgust for the world surrounding him. Quote, from the outset, I saw fit to devote myself to the overthrow of society, end quote, Debord asserts. This was in a period when any such outcome was a distant prospect indeed, end quote. Since then I have not changed my attitude once or even on several occasions, as others have, with the changing of the times. Rather, the time has changed in accordance with my attitude. The times have changed in accordance with my attitude, end quote. This was not meant to imply swearing allegiance once and for all to some immutable truth, but attending closely to the ever new conditions under which a project that remained identical in its fundamental intent had to be developed. The situationists themselves often stressed that their theory had evolved and overcome initial errors, yet they saw very little merit in anyone's arriving at the same conclusions as they, but years afterward. The singularity of a Debord is perhaps greater in France than it might be elsewhere. France's intellectuals, bound to the state as functionaries since the time of Richelieu, have developed an endless capacity, especially in recent debates, for adapting to the fashions of the moment, for collaborating with people they previously detested, or for making their peace with the state the moment there was something in it for them. The 1968 generation has illustrated this tendency to perfection. One has only to think of how grotesque the Maoist Althusserians metamorphosed in a few years into the, quote, new philosophers, end quote, or, quote, postmodernists, end quote. This is the context in which we should place the proud isolation defended in Debord's last book and summed up in his pronouncement, quote, I have lived everywhere except among the intellectuals of these times, end quote, Debord. the firmness of this posture meant that Debord found himself, not perhaps without a degree of pleasure, almost entirely on his own. Debord broke with almost everyone who ever collaborated with him, often on the worst of terms, and would note with some satisfaction that those expelled from the Situationist International or distanced from Debord in some other way almost always ended up making one kind of accommodation or another with the system. Debord claimed, and there is no reason to doubt Debord, that Debord never asked anything of anyone, that it was always others who approached him. The fascination that Debord holds for many people may be attributed to Debord's style, in his life as in his writing. There's a remarkable combination in Debord between a formalist, austere, and, quote, classical, end quote, tendency, and a constant appeal to disorder, hedonism, and the most extreme revolutionary fervor. Debord's aristocratic spirit and predilection for the 17th century coexist in paradoxical harmony with the agenda of the proletarian revolution, approbation for certain types of youthful banditry, and the cartloads of insults tipped on his opponents. It would be trite, however, to characterize this mixture as, quote, aestheticism, end quote. Debord has often been compared to André Breton on account of it, as also on account of the firmness Debord applied to running the Situationist International, and the rigor with which Debord defined orthodoxy within the ranks of these enemies of all orthodoxy. Footnote. The first to compare Debord to Breton was in fact Oscar Jorn. After his departure from the Situationist International, Jorn recalled that in the wake of Cobra's dissolution, he had wanted to found a new group, but one that would avoid the confusion and the Nordic accent of Cobra. This led Jorn, he writes, quote, to seek the collaboration of a man who, to my mind, could be the ideal successor to André Breton. As a fertile promoter of new ideas, I refer to Guy Debord, and nothing since that time has caused me to revise my opinion of him. Jorn also appreciated Debord's politico-Latin training. Quote, political Latin training, end quote. See Oscar Jorn, signe gravé sur les églises de l'Eur et du Calvados, or Calvado, Copenhagen, Borgen, 1964, 290 and 294. Later, along with many other people in the French press, decided that Debord and Breton were alike in that they were both, quote, popes, end quote. Even Debord did not seem to find the comparison particularly shocking. End footnote. Another modern figure to whom Debord might be likened to is Karl Kraus, for the two have very many common traits: the extreme care taken with words, the finely hewn sentences so well designed to condemn without appeal or discussion, the high-handed dismissal of all, quote, public opinion, end quote, especially as represented by the press, by the long struggle against a world for whose approval or condemnation they cared not a jot, and the lack of interest in any kind of, quote, career, end quote. I don't know if I'm speaking of the same person. I don't have my laptop here, so I can't look Karl Kraus up. But I remember reading a book on Rosa Luxemburg, and by Michael Brie, who is from, he's like a German guy. He's like associated with the Rosa Luxemburg Shift Tongue or whatever, the like think tank or whatever. And like that's actually a good book if you read it. Like his book on Rosa Luxemburg, it actually says like surprisingly like libertarian things, but he's a really good essay. Those who don't want to speak about Leninism should also keep quiet about Stalinism. I think that might be in both his book on Michael Brie's book on Rosa Luxemburg and his book on Lenin, which both are very good if you're curious. But he says that like Rosa Luxemburg is one of the best polemicists of the 20th century, and the person I think he compares her to is Karl Kraus, who I think also was very like good at like polemic, and that's probably what is why people are comparing Karl Kraus to Guy Debord in this context. The lone struggle against a world for whose approval or condemnation they cared not a jot, and the lack of interest in any kind of, quote, career, end quote. So back to the text. Both Debord and Kraus had very high opinions of themselves, and both drew on great reservoirs of contempt. Perhaps most significant of all, both related in the same way to their public and to their admirers. The more admirers of such figures are spurned, the more avidly they tend to attach themselves to these, quote, masters, end quote. And in this sense, Debord, like Kraus, exemplified the paradox of extreme freedom appearing to others as extreme authority. Elias Canetti tells us how, tells how, having been a fervent admirer of Krauss in his youth, Canetti dared not for many years read a single line of any author whom Krauss had disparaged. Likewise, there are not a few people in France and elsewhere who have made articles of faith out of any and all of Debord's opinions, whether of persons or of wines, as out of his way of writing, or out of what they suppose to be the way he led his life. Footnote. See Elias Canetti, Die Fackel im Ohr, Leben Gesichter, 1921 to 1931. End footnote. And Krauss and Debord invariably found their contempt confirmed by, quote, acquaintanceship with that genuinely contemptible individual, the spectator, end quote. Debord, Society of the Spectacle. Footnote. Cham Lieb published Krauss's aphorisms in French for the first time, beginning in 1975. Debord's sole, somewhat stealthy mention of Krauss, however, was not exactly complimentary. See Quête mauvaise réputation. End footnote. To this sketch of the, quote, character, end quote, we must add Debord's ability to stylize and dramatize events, lending them historical resonance by identifying the participants with those of moments in the past. Footnote. The title of the veritable spirit in the International is a détournement of the title of the alleged splits in the International, which Marx and Engels explain the exclusion of the anarchists from the First International in 1872. In their correspondence, Debord and Sanguinetti signed a, quote, Cavalcanti, end quote, Niccolo, signed as, quote, Cavalcanti and, quote, Niccolo Machiavelli, respectively. End footnote. There is a whole culture of the, quote, gesture, end quote, to be found here. Nothing was fortuitous in what Debord chose to present to the world, and the image of himself was worked up in the finest detail. Debord's claim that he had carried out a personal, quote, revolution of everyday life, end quote, of his own was not devoid of foundation. Two short novels by Michel Bernstein, Tous les chevaux du roi, All the King's Horses, and La Nuit, in 1960 and 1961 respectively, offer a lively account of the hedonistic and experimental life that she led with Debord, especially with respect to love relationships. It is true, of course, that much of this had to do with the climate of the times. End footnote. Debord describes his ambitions as, quote, megalomaniacal, end quote, and this beyond any results actually achieved. Thus, again, in his own words, there was to be, quote, neither success nor failure for Guy Debord and his outrageous pretensions, end quote. He wanted a life of adventure, and rather than exploring grottos or dabbling in high finance, Debord chose an attack on existing society as the most seductive of enterprises. Debord proceeded to realize for himself something that, according to his theory, was now possible on a general scale, namely to live one's own life as a historical adventure. To a degree rarely achieved in this century, Debord succeeded in turning his life into a legend. By the time the Situationist International was disbanded, that life had already long enjoyed mythical status. Quote, is there any greater action in the world than leading a party, end quote, asked Paul Gandhi, Cardinal de Retz, 1613 to 79, and his words might well be applied to Debord. Debord was a great admirer of Retz. He quoted his memoirs in several places and has him make ephemeral appearances in his last films and writings. He clearly identified, to the point of playfully adopting his name, with this distinctly ecclesiastical cardinal who was the moving spirit of the Fronde, and who on several occasions roused the Parisian populace, amidst which he lived without being of it. As early as 1956, Debord noted that, quote, the extraordinary ludic value of Gandhi's life, as of that Fronde of which he was the chief architect, have yet to be viewed in a truly modern light, end quote, Debord. What Debord admired in Retz was the fact that throughout his adventurous life and continual conspiracies, Retz was motivated not by ambition, but by the desire to rejoice in the drama of situations, to dabble with sets of historical contingencies. Paul Gandhi, Cardinal de Retz, was in the highest degree an embodiment of the Baroque concept of the world as a great theater, where one must play a part, strike the imagination, create dramatic effects, present what one has to say in an unprecedented way, and thus take center stage. The situationist learned a great deal from Cardinal de Retz, even though he lacked the protean quality that allowed Gandhi to play Paul Gandhi, Cardinal de Retz, to play the most varied roles. Debord, too, conceived of himself as a, quote, leader of the game, end quote, a strategist carefully observing the dynamics of human groups and intervening only at the most propitious moment. Both men, following a relative failure on the stage of history, derived great pleasure from the narration of their past actions, sometimes perhaps even exaggerating the importance of their part in events. The conception of history as a game, albeit at times a very serious game, an interplay of forces, led Debord to take a great interest in strategy, both in the strict military sense of the word and in the sense of a calculus of those forces, prospects, and human factors that may offer, quote, game leaders, end quote, the opportunity to deploy their intelligence. In his film, In Guerre imus not et consumimur igni, he depicted himself as the commander of an army of subversion, and the whole film is replete with military metaphors and images of battle. Some years later, Clausewitz had become one of the authors most often cited by the situationists. Champ Lieb undertook the publication of Clausewitz's complete works, along with that of other classics of strategy. Debord even devised a war game that was produced in various versions and published an account of a typical game in which he and Alice Becker-Ho were the two players. Footnote: Alice Becker-Ho and Guy Debord, les, quote, jeux de la guerre, end quote, relevé des positions successives des taupes, les forces au cours d'une partie. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but hey. End footnote. Debord concluded that the theory he had developed was in no sense a philosophical exercise, for, quote, theories are made only to die in the war of time. They are stronger or weaker units to be thrown at the right moment into the combat, end quote. All history is nothing but a perpetual conflict, a few rules of which we must learn as best we can. Such considerations carried Debord beyond mere military strategy to authors who had sought to define the rules of the game of history and society: Machiavelli, Balthasar Gracian, and Castiglione. This interest of his could be interpreted as a desire to remain moored to a world still essentially intelligible, where the passions could run their own course because they enjoyed a margin of uncertainty, in a universe that was in other respects by no means an indecipherable chaos, but indeed to a high degree predictable. Such had been the world of Retz, or who's Paul Gandhi, Cardinal of Retz, right? Was it Cardinal? Cardinal de Retz. In this perspective, politics was a great chess game, complete with its surprise and its rules of play. Debord's strategic conception was clearly of 18th century inspiration, and it's not surprising that Debord had little to say about modern notions of strategy. This adherence to the classical model in which two armies following lengthy preparatory maneuvers confront one another in a set battle constitutes at once a major strength and a major weakness of Debord's thought, for it tends to reduce society to two opposing monolithic blocks, neither of which has any serious internal contradictions, and one of which may be either the proletariat or simply the situationist or even just Debord himself. On many occasions, Debord admitted to an affinity for the Baroque. Perhaps this had to do with the fact that the Baroque transcended the, quote, classico-romantic dichotomy, end quote, which the situationists deemed, quote, already so unfortunate in Marx, end quote, or else that the observation that the feudal lords of the Baroque period had enjoyed, quote, the free play of an irreversible time, end quote, the, quote, relatively playful conditions, end quote, ensured by a semi-independence from the state. Progress might have brought such a life within everyone's reach, turned everyone into a, quote, master without slaves, end quote, but instead the Baroque world had been replaced by the bourgeois world of calculation and commodities. In their campaign against functionalism and in favor of play, the young letterists already set great store by the Baroque for the importance it lent each work of art as a creator of atmosphere and a generator of a style of life. The most profound reason for Debord's interest in the Baroque, however, is that it was the highest expression of the art of time, of historical time. In his words, it was, quote, the art of change, end quote. The Baroque and its sequels, quote, from Romanticism to Cubism, end quote, exuded the negative work of time, dissolving all attempts by various classicisms to congeal the state of society at a particular moment in a permanent condition of human life. Quote, theater and festival or theatrical festival, these are the essential moments of the Baroque, end quote, for they were moments that expressed transition. There was thus a sense in which the Baroque prefigured that, quote, supersession and realization, end quote, of art to which the situationists aspired. The transcendence of art had to usher in a life enriched at every instant by an outpouring of creativity, by a lavish spirit quite unmindful of conservation, not by imprisonment in works of art with claims on eternity. One of the spurs to the Baroque sensibility was an acute awareness of human fragility with respect to time. Debord, for his part, gave the situationist project a kind of existential underpinning. The acceptance of the passage of time as opposed to traditional art's reassuring fixation of time and embrace of the eternal. We have already seen that he conceived of history as the essence of man and condemned the negation of history by the false eternal present of the spectacle. In his rapport sur la construction des situations, he writes, quote, the main effective drama in life is one. If one discounts the perpetual conflict between desire and a reality hostile to desire, must surely be the feeling of time slipping away. The situationist attitude here, in contrast to aesthetic procedures that tended to still emotion, is to bank on that very slipping away of time, end quote. Quote, constructed situations, end quote, differed from traditional works of art by virtue of their rejection of any wish to create something lasting. Thus, the antagonism between life and survival also exists on the artistic plane as the antagonism between life and, quote, survival through the work, end quote. Quote, the sensation of time slipping by has always been a keen one for me, and I have been attracted to it, so I've been attracted by it as others are attracted by the void or by water, end quote. The deep theme of Debord's adventure is contained in the words, quote, O gentlemen, the time of life is short, ... and if we live to tread on kings, end quote. That's from footnote, Henry the Fourth, Part 1. These lines serve as an epigraph for chapters 5 of the Society of the Spectacle. Contrary to the lesson of exchange value, which is the illusion that everything is always possible because everything is equivalent, the qualitative, like passion, can arise only from a consciousness of the irreversibility and uniqueness of human actions. Quote, but those who have chosen time as their weapon know that it is also their master, and that they cannot complain about this. It is also the master of those without weapons, and indeed in their case a harsher one, end quote. Likewise, in the spectacle, the, quote, social absence of death, end quote, is simply the reverse side of the absence of death. Quote, the consciousness of the spectator can have no sense of an individual life moving toward self-realization or toward death, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 160. An unmistakable sign of the pro-situationist's ineptness is thus the refusal to recognize this dimension. Quote, time frightens him because it is made of qualitative leaps, of irreversible choices, of occasions which will never return, end quote. That is why such people, quote, who have not yet begun to live, but who are saving themselves for a better period, whence their immense fear of growing old, expect nothing less than a permanent paradise, end quote. They are the very opposite of Debord's companions of 1952, who never, quote, left these few streets and these few tables where the culminating point of the time had been discovered, end quote. Where, quote, time burned with more heat than elsewhere and would never suffice, end quote. Where one heard, quote, the roar of the cataract of time, end quote, and declaimed, quote, never again will we drink so young, end quote. Debord's writing, and especially the last ones, are notable too for the beauty of their many quotations. Pride of place is accorded those which deal with the vanity of human beings and the slipping away of time. Omar Khayyam and Shakespeare, Homer and Ecclesiastes. In 1980, Debord published a French translation of the 15th century Spanish poem Coplas de Don Jorge Manrique por la muerte de su Padre, whose author, in Mourning for his father, reflects that, quote, cualquier tiempo pasado / fue mejor, end quote, any past time / were better. This mood, coupled with Debord's extreme contempt for the petty lives of those who passively submitted to the spectacle, eventually turned him, like King Solomon, into a, quote, contemner of the world, end quote. They also turned him into a figure comparable to the great moralists of the French classical period. By this time, Debord no longer felt in the least as though he were in the vanguard of a powerful social movement, but his claim to being the only free individual in a society of slaves gave birth to many pages of sober beauty very rarely encountered today. Yet this shift of emphasis in Debord's thinking, which led him to the sad conclusion that François Villon was right when he said, quote, le monde n'est qu'abusant, end quote, the world is nothing but deception, did not prevent him from remaining a highly vigilant witness to his time. Séjourns in Italy in the 70s gave him the chance closely to observe a situation which in many ways resembled the kind of social revolt that he had always called for, and to study the countermeasures taken by the authorities. Quote, Italy sums up the social contradictions of the entire world, end quote, Debord wrote, quote, striving in an all too familiar way to solidify in a single country the repressive holy alliance of class power in both its bourgeois and bureaucratic totalitarian versions, end quote, Debord. Debord and his Italian friends were among the first to accuse the state of manipulating the terrorism of the period so to check subversive tendencies rendered particularly threatening by the fact that the workers were escaping from the traditional control of the Communist Party. Footnote. Thus, in 1975, using the pseudonym Censor, Gianfranco Sanguinetti issued his Rapporto Verdiso sulle ultime opportunità de salvare il capitalismo in Italia, a veracious report on the last chance of saving capitalism in Italy, a pamphlet purporting to have been written by a member of the haute bourgeoisie who saw participation by the Communist Party in the Italian government as the only hope of diffusing subversive action by the workers. The hoax was successful and created quite a stir in Italy. Debord quickly translated the text into French. End footnote. In his preface to the fourth edition of the In his preface to the fourth Italian edition of the Society of the Spectacle, published in 1979, Debord analyzed the part played by the abduction of Aldo Moro and the function of the Italian Communist Party in the resolution of the state crisis. Debord's conclusions are generally accepted today, but at the time they were completely beyond the pale. Quote, the Italian authorities, end quote, quote, the Italian authorities version, end quote, Debord wrote, quote, was not credible for an instant. Its intent was not to be believed, but to be the only version on offer, end quote. Years later, Italian parliamentary commissions would themselves find that the Red Brigades had been manipulated in some way by a faction within the state apparatus. The end. Thank you for listening. That was the Debord Myth in part 2 of the practice, in part 2, the practice of theory in Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord. Thank you for listening.